Hello and welcome to another episode of the Construction Corner podcast. I'm Dylan, I'm your host, and today on this episode, guys, it is just going to be me. I am going to rant, as you can see by this title, about energy production and quote unquote green energy in the United States. Now, this is going to be a heated topic for me, and this is kind of following up to many discussions that we've had. And some of this gets heard last week from my conversation with Todd. Now, I'm going to start with something pretty simple, straightforward, and I'm just going to read from this list because I think it's a good basis to start from when we talk about electrical production. So, when we look at the amount of energy that is generated in the United States, we are looking at 4.116 trillion kilowatt hours. 4,116 billion kilowatt hours. So 4.1 trillion kilowatt hours is what we're doing. Now, breaking this down, 60.8% of that is generated by fossil fuels together as a category. Nuclear follows at 18.9%. Renewables altogether, which we're going to break that one down into its component parts, but 20.1% into renewables. Pumped storage hydropower is actually a negative 0.1%. And then other sources, which could be like non-biogenic municipal solid waste, batteries, hydrogen, purchased steam, sulfur, tire delivered or derived fuel, and miscellaneous energy sources. So, out of this, let's break this down a little bit. Fossil fuels, 60.8%. So, most of our electricity generation comes from natural gas, coal, and some other stuff. But really, natural gas at 38.3% is where the majority of our power comes from. 21.8% comes from coal. And then also within fossil fuels, so there's petroleum's categories. 0.3% is from petroleum liquid, 0.2% from petroleum coke, and then 0.3% from other gases. It's like blast furnace, other manufactured waste, and gases derived from fossil fuels is how they classify that. Nuclear, again, at 18.9%, and then renewables. And so let's break this down. So total power generation from, quote, renewables is 20.1%. And you'll see why I say quotes here in just a second. So wind is 9.2%. Again, this is of total power generation in the country. Hydropower, 6.3%. Solar, 2.8%. And that's split between PV and solar thermal. And then biomass is 1.3%. That's wood, landfill gas, municipal solid waste, other biomass waste, and then geothermal is actually broken out into its own category at 0.4% of total power generation. Now, so when we go back to renewables, the reason that I say quote unquote is that so one of the things that irks me is the state of Oregon had a renewables target of like and I have to go back and look this up, but I believe it was 15% of total power generation for the state was going to be through renewables. Okay. That includes, to them, wind and solar. Does not include water. Why? Because the state of Oregon and most of the West Coast gets the majority of their power from hydroelectric. It all comes from the Columbia River, and that is where most of the power production comes for the West Coast. So, kind of an interesting point there. But again, this is as we go through it. So really, if you take out hydro into its own category, which supplies 6.3% of the U.S.'s power, then we look at wind, 9.2, solar, 2.8, and then biomass at 1.3. If we consider that renewable, which they're doing here as well, that wood, landfill gas, municipal waste, and other biomass waste is a renewable, as well as geothermal. So wind and solar, these are typically the big two, and I'm good with wind. but we'll get into, there's some drawbacks to it. And then solar, 2.8%, right? So as prolific as solar ends up being, it is only 2.8% of the total power production. There's a caveat in here, I will point it out, in that it does not include the PV on houses, which is all net metered system. So this is all utility scale generation. So basically this power production at the 4.116 trillion kilowatt hours includes, or does not include, so the number becomes bigger, but this is basically all energy delivered by utility in the country, because this is all that's metered on a national scale. It's all recorded. Net metering is not recorded necessarily to a database like this, and this is from the Energy Information Administration, independent government agency. So, say what you will, usually their data is pretty good. People just interpret the data pretty poorly typically. So anyway, now on this, fossil fuels account for 60.8% of our power grid. So the thing that I ultimately have a problem with, and you start seeing articles like Germany is having power issues, their grid is going down, and you're like, why can that be? Germany has all the green energy in it. They're the most advanced, most green country in the EU. How in the world is it that they have no electricity, that their grid is going down, and that power production is a problem in a country that is so advanced? Short answer, they shut off their nuclear plants. They don't have a lot of hydro. They choose to not import natural gas from places like Russia that has a ton of it, and therefore they rely on wind to do this. Germany is not that sunny of a country. If you look at where it lays in the latitude lines, it's pretty far north, if you ever look at a map. And so they don't get a ton of sun. And then their wind is, okay. But wind, as we can see here, and there's a ton of wind in a lot of places, it is only 9.2% of all power production in the U.S. So you need to make up for it somewhere. Bottom line, the other side of this. So let's talk about the greenness of it. And one of the things that Todd and I talked about and spoke about was really when you get into resiliency versus efficiency. And this is a thing where I really get pretty worked up is, one, people don't do their homework in the history of like how these power outages happen, right? So the one that we talked about was in New York, and that was from a fault near a power generation station. The reason I know this is I had a professor who used to work there and knew the story from people that did work there. So with that, they had a frequency issue, and it caused cascading blackouts because it was near such a large power production facility, and that made cascading blackouts. So again, when you take out the biggest thing in the system, not everything can increase their capacity to take over what was lost within that system. It's effectively how this stuff works. So then you lead to cascading problems, frequency issues, which is the only mandate of any utility company. It is not voltage, it is not current, it is frequency. So when we get down to these, and it does become very technical pretty quickly, I'll try to be as high level on this stuff as possible. So when we talk about renewables versus fossil fuels, which, in case you hadn't noticed, we continue to quote unquote find more oil, so it does renew itself. Coal, not as much, and I don't know why that's in a fossil fuel necessarily for the makeup of coal, and then natural gas, which is give you that one on fossil fuels, right? So when we start to break these things down, the thing that we want to bring up is CO2, right? Emissions, all that kind of stuff. And what really everybody forgets, and I'm just going to look at wind and solar, not so much hydro. Hydro is actually a very low emissions piece if you don't necessarily care a whole bunch about the fish, even though we fixed all that. So if you don't care about some salmon, or some other trout or whatever, which they do survive going through it, through the turbines, is it's made of concrete, which concrete, absorbs CO2. And once it's built, it's built. The steel and rebar used, again, like most of the dams that we have in the U.S., were built in the 60s. So they've been up for 60 years. And, with minor, they still need maintenance. They still need updates, all that kind of good stuff. But it's not like we've re-poured the dams for hydro production. So there's that. So we'll leave hydro there. Wind and solar. Let's talk about them and their footprint in what it is that is created. So again, leaving all the actual utility infrastructure, so transformers, which actually we can get into that too. So here's the thing. You start to go and look at where these are located. You start to look at the distances for them. You start to look at the materials that are used to actually generate the power, and then the other things that you need behind wind, solar, things like that. There's more infrastructure that's needed for those than there are for fossil fuel or nuclear plants. Again, leaving hydro out of this one because it is a base power. It's more similar to nuclear than just about anything else in terms of power production and consistency of power production. So where I want to go with this is, one, fossil sources are inherently renewable. We do find more of it. It still gets, created. It is natural to the earth. It is not man-made, right? Unlike wind turbines and solar panels. Those are both man-made devices. Now, when we look at power production, so the grid is actually very, very good, and the people that run the grid are very, very talented at estimating loads, which, to see some of the ways that they used to do this by like plumb bob, and I'm not kidding when they use a plumb bob for power generation and the charts that they had in the stations to do this. I've seen them. It's pretty amazing that the math and the creativity and the ability to basically forecast demand load onto their power plants and how much power they would need to generate, and they would they can ramp up or down a generator, a turbine, in 15-minute increments. So this is not by any means instantaneous. They do have some instantaneous capacities, but to ramp up or down onto the grid and maintain frequency of the generators is of the utmost, right? You cannot spin these things up immediately. Neither can you spin them down instantly. And if you do, there's megawatts of steam, which is what powers most of these turbines, that gets discharged into the air when that happens. So, whether you're using natural gas, coal, or nuclear, the turbine and basically the electricity generation is effectively the same, right? They heat steam, and then that in turn powers a turbine, which in turn creates electricity. So when we talk about this, it's really the fuel that's used to spin to heat gas, and then, or steam, dry steam, and then run that through a turbine, which then in turn creates electricity. So there's similar things when we talk about like full-scale power generation facilities and how this is done. So when we talk about going through these fuel sources, I'm trying to weave this in and make it as easy to understand as possible, guys, and not be super complicated about how things are generated or get too technical or in the weeds on this. So bear with me as I go through all this and how power is produced. So as it goes through that process, right, from heating water to creating dry steam, and it goes through a few other processes and steps in there to then being able to generate electricity to go out onto the grid. So really, on the face of it, most natural gas, coal, and nuclear plants are very similar in that regards, in to a sense, hydro plants. But again, they cannot ramp quickly or slowly. And then if they do go all the way cold, these things do take like days to start back up, 30 to 48 plus hours to start some of these larger turbines and the whole system back up, to get everything back up to temperature, to get everything back up to speed, to get them into frequency, right? They have to maintain 60 hertz here in the US, and it's like 60 hertz plus or minus like 0.2. Like, it is very accurate on the frequency across the entire grid. So that is their mandate. That is what they need to do to maintain the integrity of the grid. So now we have this, right? Natural gas gets piped in to these power plants. Like when I lived in Louisville, they piped natural gas all the way from Texas to Louisville, specifically for a power plant. Coal, they transport most of that on barges throughout the Midwest, or trains. Those are the two ways that they move coal. Natural gas, again, on a pipeline. Nuclear, again, once those plants are up and running, they're pretty much self-contained in their power production. And then hydro, again, pretty much self-contained in its ability to generate power, and again, with some ability to increase or decrease the amount of power within a 15-minute increment that it's able to do. Now, all of those are, so nuclear and hydro are what we call base power generation facilities. So as we look at how much power is needed or required at a given hour of the day, right? Because that's how a lot of these plants, or that is how these power generation facilities operate, right? They pretty much look at the hour, and at the top of the hour or upcoming to the hour, they change what their power output is going to be within those 15-minute increments to do that. Usually it's at the top of the hour. So when we go through this for coal, nuclear, hydro, it is all of our base load, meaning that we know that we're going to get X amount of kilowatt hours or megawatt hours out of these particular generation facilities, and we're going to get that 24 hours a day. We just know that. So then when it comes to these fluctuations, right, the whole like peak load time, which is around like 4 p.m. And 6 a.m., right, as people are going to work, getting home from work, turning on all the stuff in their house, and your offices and everything are still working as well. So you have kind of these overlapping hours when people are at home as well as the office, that you need what are called peaking plants, right? So peak power generation time, right? When it's really hot, you need to produce more power so people can run their AC. So with that, you have these peaking plants like natural gas that can be spun up fairly quickly and take over those loads as required. And so you need something that can spin fairly fast and produce, significantly more energy in short periods of time. And that's typically done with natural gas. It's like the easiest one to do. Coal also is pretty much a base material. Coal, nuclear, hydro, like you can't necessarily get much more out of any of them in a relatively short period of time. So natural gas is what we call peaking plants, and then they kind of take the variability in the amount of power that is generated. We pretty much leave nuclear, hydro, and coal alone by and large. So on the other side of this, right, you then have so that's how kind of power is scheduled, how it's generated. And then let's talk about renewables. And specifically, I'm going to talk about wind and solar. With these two in particular, you have two entities that are hard to accurately predict the output of, right? You believe that it's going to be windy tomorrow, but you don't know how much wind for a given interval of time during the day. And on the other side of that, how much power it's going to produce when the wind does blow, right? Is it 15? Does it come at the right times and angles? Because it does take time for a windmill to adjust to maximize its power output for a given wind direction. Makes sense, right? You got to put the blades into the wind so that it spins the blades and that you get the most power out of the wind for those turbines to then turn into electricity. Solar, same thing, right? You know it's going to be sunny, but is there going to be a cloud that happens to sit right over your solar field, right? Is it going to be full sun? What's the actual intensity of the sun? How much, dirt and debris is built up on the solar panels? So you don't have as good of a accuracy measurement for like solar or wind as you do with these other sources. So for utility scale installation, it makes it very difficult to plan because it has to work in concert with the other sources of energy, right? These things do not sit on an island. You do not get all your power from wind or solar. It's combined with other types of electricity. Now, let's talk about the plant life cycle and kind of overall pieces that go into this. And hopefully I've explained this pretty well, where you have base load, you have peaking load, you have how power is made, you have the breakdown of it, right? Again, 60.8% of all electricity production is from fossil fuels. Nuclear is 18.9, renewable, quote unquote, is 20.1. If you take out hydro, it goes down to 14 or 13.8% power production through renewables. And really, if you just add wind and solar, it's going to be 12% is what the combined wind and solar renewable production is. Now, let's talk about the infrastructure that goes around each of these. So, fossil fuels, nuclear, hydro, and grid scale solar are going to be very similar in the utility needs that the utility needs to take that power and then push it out to the grid and distribute it to your house, right? There's going to be a generator, transformer, and then all the transmission lines to get that power from wherever it's produced to your house, right? However many tens or hundreds of miles away. Very similar. Solar is going to be pretty much that. They're going to connect all the solar panels. There's going to be some electronics in there, and then it'll go to a transformer and then out onto the grid. Same with nuclear, same with any fossil fuel, and pretty much the same with hydropower, right? Produced right there, goes through transformers, switching station, transmission lines, out to, your house. Wind, on the other hand. So for every single windmill, there is a transformer at the bottom of it. So there's technically going to be more infrastructure for windmills than pretty much anything else. So the engine, if you will, the turbine for a windmill, a wind turbine, is at the very center of that pivot, right? So where the blades connect into that housing, at the very center of that, behind it on the post, effectively, right on the shaft of the windmill, at the very top is where the engine sits to, or the generator, effectively, to transform that wind energy into electricity. So all the electronics and engine, or I'm saying engine, but really a generator sit at the top, and that's what produces power. And then all the cables go down through the middle of the shaft, and then they hit a transformer at the bottom. And then the transformer, and they've got some other electronics and stuff to regulate the frequency of it. And then that transformer puts it out onto the grid. So there is more infrastructure for windmills. And again, they have to kind of regulate the windmill's production of power, because again, if it's very windy at a time where they do not need a ton of power with the base load, then like they don't really need any wind, right? So and the same is going to go for solar, to where because you're not going to ever really reduce a nuclear plant or a hydro plant, or in particular a coal plant. So if there's wind or solar combined with those base generation, then and the base load is taking care of all the other power production, or let's just say most of it, and then you need 10% of whatever the wind capacity that you have or generation that is going on at the time. Then the other 90% of that wind you're just not going to use. It'll go nowhere, and effectively is wasted because it's just not needed. So what this comes down to is you have a storage problem, right? And because wind is intermittent, inherently you have a storage problem, right? You might be able to use the wind. It might be enough. It might not be. You might have too much or too little at any given period of time for wind, and the same with solar. So inherently you have to have storage on top of that. But here's the other thing with hydro, or with wind and with solar in particular, as compared to hydro, natural gas, coal, and petroleum. And there's some things too that I'll get into that's problematic with really coal in particular, but we'll get there in a minute. So when you look at the production of all these plants, because the whole green thing, you've got to look at the full life cycle of what this is, right? Hey, we're harnessing the wind. Sounds great. Sounds amazing. But what goes into harnessing the wind is really what we end up talking here about in the full life cycle and doing the math of what this actually comes down to. So when you look at wind, one, you have a storage problem. Two, those blades are made of carbon fiber. The shaft is made of steel. You have a generator in the top of it, plus all the other electronics, and then you have additional transformers at the base of them, and all the oil that goes into those transformers, is a whole other thing. When we look at a natural gas plant, coal plant, even a nuclear plant, right? Everything that goes into there, well, let's leave out nuclear for now because the lead and the other cake material that they have to discard of is a problem. Same with natural gas. So I'll just do it now. So with coal and nuclear, you end up having heavy metals, or really coal, you have heavy metals that you have to get rid of. So when you burn coal, there's all these heavy metals that end up being in coal in trace amounts, and then they, when they burn it, it goes up these stacks, and then from there, they basically have these chemical processes that they use to take out those heavy metals, so they do not go and evaporate into the air. They contain them and condense them per law. So this is the thing. They're required by law to do this, and to basically condense all those heavy metals into single, basically barrels of these heavy metals. So now you have a very high concentration of heavy metals that is, again, required by law for these coal plants to extract from their air. So now you have a disposal problem with these heavy metals, right? Mercury and a whole bunch of others that are, in these very, very high concentrations is what you end up having. Now you have a toxicity problem versus in the trace amounts that we get dispersed through the air, which for sure causes its own problems. But this is what you end up with, in particular with coal, is this dispersion. You go from a dispersion to a high concentration of heavy metals. Now, on the nuclear side, obviously you have some nuclear cake and things like that you have to get rid of. Cool thing is, if you turn nuclear material into glass, it basically makes it inert, which is kind of neat. We don't necessarily do that because it does take a lot of energy to take those cakes and then produce them into glass. But if you were to do that, it would make it inert. So cool thing, takes a lot of energy. We don't really do it. We throw it under a mountain in Nevada for a lot of nuclear waste, Yucca Mountain. So that's how that's disposed of, and that, is not great for sure. So those are really the downfalls, if you will, with like nuclear, coal. There's some of that natural gas, not to the same extent of coal. You don't really have heavy metals. You really don't have too many problems ultimately with natural gas. It's not, it's fairly clean burning. They have some things, but again, not to the volume that you end up having with coal. So natural gas plants are, really the cleanest of burning, and it's why 38.3% of all of our power is produced by natural gas. And it's fairly cheap, pretty inexpensive, easily transported. You don't have really too many problems in transporting natural gas through pipelines. Those are fairly safe versus trains or anything like that. So when we go to wind, you have to look at how windmills are produced, right? So within these windmills, to produce really a rotating electromagnetic field, you need to have rare earth magnets. And you effectively need those in any given generator, but you can do those in larger turbines that take up they're the same size magnet. You just put more power through the turbine. When you start to look at, natural gas, coal, nuclear, hydro, you can, for the same amount of magnet, you can produce more power than in a windmill. So, and you just need a ton of them. So there's rare earth magnets that you need to do this. You're doing carbon fiber, which is not the necessarily cleanest of processes to create and bleed out all the carbon fiber and create it and spin it into a piece to then use for windmill blades. And then it's a steel tower, which again, there's plenty of steel. Not opposed to any of that. So you have a little more on the transformer. It's a distributed grid a little bit, which again is more resilient, not necessarily as efficient, but those are trade-offs, right? When we talk about grid resiliency and the ability to stand up and for it to just act or be more robust, right? So the other side of wind, really, I think we're pretty much all neutral on the production of wind, hydro, natural gas, coal, nuclear. All those plants are pretty much neutral. Nuclear is by far one of the least maintenance pieces. Same with hydro. And then on wind, you do need more maintenance, and the longevity of those turbines are not all that long. Right, 10, 15 years is going to be about their lifespan, whereas nuclear plants have been operating for 60 plus years. Same with coal plants. Natural gas plants have, had longevity of 25 plus years. So there's that. Same with solar. You get about a 10, 15 year lifespan before they're going to be trashed, which is the other thing that we're going to talk about here too. So when we look at wind, you start to look at storage, and really this is the next piece. You start to look at storage needs. So now, because you have this fluctuation of power for wind and for solar, you need storage, meaning you end up needing batteries. It's the only way to really store power. You could do some of this pumped storage hydropower, which takes more power than it produces. So there is that. But anyway, so let's just take batteries. We're going to use batteries, store all this power when we have excess power produced by either wind or solar. When we really start to look at what goes into that, and when we're talking about grid scale batteries, you're talking megawatts of power. A little battery pack that you might have is maybe 100, 200, 400 milliamp hours. Or, we're talking gigaamp hours, which is an order of magnitude of 12. It's trillion, right? Billion is 9, right? Million, 100 million is 1e, 3, 6, 7, 8, 9 is a billion. So a billion is 1e9. Trillion is 1e12. That's what we're talking about here. It's huge orders of magnitude from your small little lithium ion battery that's in your laptop or one of those battery packs. We're talking massive. So when we take the amount of lithium that is in your laptop and now expand that to what is needed for grid scale storage, it is massive. Plus, most lithium ions are also made with majority nickel, and then most of which is not mined within the U.S. So there are some nickel deposits within the U.S., very little lithium. Most of that is actually out of Africa and or the Soviet bloc for lithium in China. And then for nickel, a lot of that does come out of like a lot of it's out of Africa. So when we start to look at the heavy metals that are needed to produce batteries for storage, plus plastic casings, right? So you're going to use petroleum products to produce the casings to store your batteries in, which is, like what your laptop is, right? It's all plastic, which is a petroleum product. So we start to look at, you're going to use petroleum to create the batteries. Then all the acids that are like not good for the environment that are going to be created to sit around the batteries, on the inside, that diode. And then you're going to have the plates, which are nickel and lithium. So again, very heavy metals and high concentrations are not good, especially mixed with the acids that are created in those batteries. And those batteries have about a 10-year lifespan. Past that, again, not good. So you have a shorter lifespan with all of these components. You do not produce as much power. You're going to have to replace them very frequently. And they're intermittent in power production. So when we talk about the grid and its efficiency versus resiliency, the two things, like I am for more power plants spread throughout to produce distributed loads, smaller plants take so if one goes down, the rest of the grid can handle it. Like things like that do make sense, right, from a resiliency standpoint. From an efficiency standpoint, also makes sense to do it that way, right? You could do bigger power plants and fewer of them from a power production standpoint, but you don't get the resiliency. So if you had fewer plants or more plants with smaller generation, you would therefore be more resilient with still having efficiencies, right, at grid scale production. When you look at wind and solar, while they are they're pseudo-resistant, right? There's a lot of them. They do produce power, but in today's modern age, you cannot live off the power produced off your solar panels off your house. It's just not going to happen. I lived off the grid. You're not going to do it. We ran the generator all the time. Now, in the winter with hydro, we did much better, right? It was less need for a generator because it was 24/7, 365, very reliable, especially because we got a ton of rain and we had a pond for water retention. So hydro is a very efficient, reliable source of power and, fairly resilient. Like unless a dam fails, you're going to have it. And then when we talk about PV production and solar panel production, the acid wash, the amount of chemicals, the silicon production to do that. I mean, solar panels are not made in the U.S. By and large because of these heavy chemicals that they use to create and etch the panels. Most of that's done in China. So, like when we talk about environmental conditions, to what is needed to create solar panels is not clean by any means. Obviously, it is getting better all the time, but from a power production and reliability standpoint, if the country that is producing our panels is not us, that's problematic in and of itself too. And to be reliant on rare earth metals for that need to go into all these windmills, that's also a problem. Same with all the electronics that go into solar panels and the conversion panels that also need to happen, right? To go from DC power production to AC, you have to have all the converters for solar as well. So there's some other electronics that go into it. At the end of the day, what this comes down to, and again, sorry guys, I know this is a more technical kind of deal, but what it comes down to is that when we look at our power grid, how it functions, what's proven to work, what is needed for our grid, and you got to remember this is at scale. We're talking 4 trillion kilowatt hours. Like, it's massive. solar is not going to be sustainable. Batteries, in where we stand and where we come over 100 years, is not very far, right? The amount of energy that is contained within a given metric volume of gasoline versus the same metric volume of battery is like night and day difference. There's substantially more power within a unit of gasoline than there is within a battery. Same with natural gas, same with coal. It's easily transported. Nuclear, again, that material's there, and we don't have as many, like, there's not as many transportation things, and you don't need a lot of it to create power for a long period of time. So with these, you have very reliable sources of power, been around for a long time. And when you start to look at these green alternative, quote unquote green, you really have to do the math on the rest of it. Like, you have to do the math and what goes behind the wind, behind the solar. And if they did not have government incentives, how effective would they actually be? And, somebody might say, well, the grid was built by the government, right? The TVA built the electric grid and all the rural co-ops. So that's not entirely true. So what the government did provide during that time to help electrify rural America, and you have all these electric co-ops, is they provided, at the time, quote unquote, low interest loans to communities so that they could go and build the utility lines that they needed in their community. So they provided financing. They did not actually build them. That is a big difference, right? It was not a government contract. It was not a government-led thing. They just provided the financing for rural America to go and create their own electric co-op, to put in their own utility lines, to figure out where it went, to deal with all the power stuff. They just provided financing. And it, this time, right, you had interest rates that are higher than what we have today. So, and that was their low interest. So when you look at this, the government really was not a piece in that pie. They did provide financing, but they did not provide, necessarily other incentives to make that happen. Financing is a big piece of it. Banks wouldn't touch this. So, the government did have a role in providing the financing for it, but those did have to get paid back. So when we look at these efforts, we have to really understand how the money worked. With wind, with solar, there is a lot of government subsidy in that. Now, the government did have a big part to play within hydro, that is for sure, in building the dams, blocking our rivers, the states getting involved to do that, because most of these go across state boundaries. Hydro definitely had its place. And then as for the rest of these, it's all private industry to put in nuclear plants, coal plants, natural gas plants, which again produces, if you take nuclear and fossil fuels, it is, close to 80% of our power generation. So at the end of the day, when you look at most of this, it's all done by a private entity. And then the amount of money that we've spent on hydro or on wind and solar, we could have built a lot of power plants to produce power at much cheaper rates, which again hits all of your pocketbooks. And when you do the math on solar, on hydro, or on solar, on wind, the paybacks just really are not there, even for the individual. You spend $30,000 on solar panels for your house, which is subsidized. You're still looking at a 15-year payback. It's like the time value of money is just not worth it. So hopefully this helps educate you guys on a topic that is as complex as the power grid. I know I went on about this, but it's important. It's important to do the math. It's important to think through, what each of these looks like, and to have a pretty clear picture of what, where your power comes from. When you start to look at electric vehicles and things like that, your power is more than likely, there's an 80% chance and more likely a 84% chance if you're on the eastern seaboard because you don't have hydro. And really, if you're in the Northeast, You don't have any sun either. So there's like a 90% chance, and you really don't have much wind. So there's probably like a 98% chance that your power comes from either fossil fuel or nuclear. That's just the reality of it. And we have to remember that, right? That for most of the country, for the whole eastern half of the United States, you really don't have hydro. There's very little wind in the east. Most of it's in the west, Texas, and then in parts of Indiana around the Great Lakes, and in Illinois. It's really where most of the windmills are. So if you're outside of those few areas, you're really not getting any wind power. You're probably not getting any solar power. And that's some of it that's going to be in the southeast or Florida. But even then, most of their power is coming from natural gas and nuclear, since you have the nuclear plants in Georgia and Ohio. So anyway, guys, all this to say, like, green is not what it's cracked up to be. It is not green. It is dirtier than most fossil fuel production that we have today, especially with the infrastructure that has been laid for this. And then when we look at the mining that's needed, and I am for mining, but the mining that's needed that is not local to the United States, to our regulations. A lot of people die in those mines. They're strip mining, so they're really not mining in a way that would allow the land and nature to take back over those mining operations. They're using child labor to do it. And again, most of us don't really care about kids working because you have an iPhone, which Foxconn is doing that. You're wearing Nike shoes, which again is done with child labor. So clearly most of us don't really care about kids working in these facilities because those are the companies we support. I don't wear any Nikes, but I do have an iPhone. Like, these are the things that we have to consider as we look at our power production. For most all the stuff that's anything coming in the U.S., we're working in OSHA defines everything that we do. We're working safely. We have a ton of EPA regulations. Not that I agree with all of them, but for returning things to the environment, doing it safely, less pollutants, all that kind of stuff, it does matter. So when you're getting most of your material for solar panels from not in the U.S., and then all the battery requirements for like electric vehicles, as well as the things that you need to grid scale for, which is going to be much larger in comparison to that of electric vehicles, and the mining operations that are needed to produce those metals is a whole other thing, guys. So really, really think and dig into where your power is coming from, to what pieces and parts go into power production. It's a lot deeper than you think, and it doesn't take too much to scratch the surface here to get a little deeper on these topics and be informed. It'll help you. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, guys. Thanks for listening to me. If you listen all the way to the end, I appreciate it, and we'll see you next time right here on the Construction Corner Podcast.